Everybody needs an introduction. Very briefly, Rolf Johnson taught philosophy at various colleges and universities for about 50 years, spending 39 of them in Western Connecticut State University in Danbury. After retirement, he embarked on a project of writing a book on the nature of spirituality and religion, which I assume is related to the talk. And he also has written Three Faces of Love that was published by the NIU Press in 2000. Rolf will talk to us on the topic, My Struggles with God, from Theism to Agnosticism to, and here's one that many of you probably haven't heard, Panentheism. Panentheism, which Rolf will explain.
It's been some years since I've done anything like this, and now in my mid-80s, it's a little bit more precarious than it would have been earlier, as words have a way of sort of disappearing and dropping around the floor in various places, right when they're most needed, and names as well. I've been trying to think all morning about an author who was quoted in here. Okay, I'm going to, because philosophers sort of talk funny, I want to try to present these ideas in a fairly autobiographical format. So I'll tell you a little bit about my religious background, and particularly one experience that occurred in the Methodist Church in which I was raised. I come from a very ordinary Midwestern middle-class family, Rockford, Illinois. My mother, who was Irish on her mother's side, had been raised Roman Catholic, but when she married my atheist father at the age of 18, she was already pregnant. She'd be horrified if I told you that. But she converted to Methodism, maybe thinking that kind of a halfway point between. My father actually was a very mild-mannered atheist. He wasn't a fundamentalist atheist. He simply was absolutely indifferent to religion. And would never say anything about the subject. He had never tried to interfere with my mother's attending this Methodist church and raising us there. But when I asked him once about religion, all he said was that he thinks it's for children and for old people. But when he was the age that I am now, 85, and living in a nursing home, quite near the end of his life, he didn't become one bit more religious, thereby refuting his own theory. He turned instead to spirits rather than to spirituality, a familiar move. When it was a Swedish Methodist church that I was raised, and the two earliest clergymen that I remember from my early time there were both from the old country and both named Erickson. But all that I can remember about either of them saying is one of them explaining to the congregation one morning that if God had intended us to smoke, he would have provided us with chimneys. It evidently worked for me. I never did take up the habit. But the crucial event occurred somewhat later. I think I must have been in 4th or 5th grade. And in school, I had seen a portrayal of what then, in the 40s, we called a caveman. And he was a guy who you probably wouldn't let in the door if he came around here. He was represented as quite short, but very thickly built, protruding jaw, sloping forehead, kind of stooped posture, very hairy body, club over one shoulder. And sometime after that, I went to church, and on the Sunday school bulletin, there was a picture of Adam and Eve. Tall, erect, Northern European, looked remarkably like the people in the congregation, somewhat better looking, I think. Both, hiding from God. They must have caught, the artist caught Adam and Eve at the very moment that God is saying to them, have you eaten of the tree that I told you not to eat of? And I don't know if you've noticed, particularly the next episode, in case you think there's no humor in the Bible, Adam says, the woman you gave me. Twice he passes the buck. Sometimes I think that may be the most powerful moral lesson contained in the Bible. Most of us have lost track of most of the Ten Commandments, but that one lingers. I put it to good use a few times myself. Okay, and so there I was in Sunday school, looking at this picture of Adam and Eve, and remembering the caveman, and I was kind of bewildered. So I said to the young woman who was the Sunday school teacher, that how is it that that Adam and Eve looked very much like us, but yet sometime later, when the cavemen came along, they had this kind of ape-like appearance. And her response was to kick me under the table and give me a dirty look. So that, thus are the seeds of religious doubt born. You may have had similar experiences. From that point on, I think I was, sort of vaguely a theist. I never really thought too much about these things. But in my freshman year in college, I had in the second semester a roommate with a very philosophical name of Seneca, who introduced me to the word agnosticism, which I had never heard before. So I quickly converted and began to worship, doubt and uncertainty rather than God. It seemed like a good practice. And it was sometime after that I started studying philosophy, I think probably in my junior year before I took my first class. And I wrote my first philosophy paper on what's known as the problem of evil, which is the problem of reconciling the omnipotence of God, his omniscience, and perfect goodness, and trying to make sense of how there could be evil in the world if God was powerful enough to prevent it and knew before he created the world that would be there. And it seemed to me an insuperable problem. So this is kind of my brief left brain history. Very much an attitude of religious skepticism, not being much interested in the notion of God at all. But in the meantime, in my right brain, real life, things were taking a somewhat different course. And I'm not sure that I particularly noticed the relationship between the two of them at the time. But one of the things that I began doing was taking yoga classes. And I think you're all familiar with the namaste gesture. And it was told to me that this is a way of acknowledging the divine within other people. We've heard about Hinduism already this morning. I found the experience absolutely delicious, and I still do. I've done it here at some of these meetings. I will just spontaneously, go into this sort of posture. So what gradually began emerging in my life was not quite something so fancy as Panentheism, but simply this notion of the ubiquity of the sacred, a very deep felt experience that there is something inherently sacred or holy, not as set apart in some eternal separate realm, although it might be related to something there that's hard to know about, but as a presence in our personal life. I've come to think of the sacred or the holy as what probably philosophers would call a tertiary quality. There are primary qualities like mass and motion, which can be quantified and studied very rigorously. Then there are secondary qualities, such as color, taste, smell, and so on. But there are also these tertiary qualities, which seem to me quite real, even if we cannot account for them in a really rigorous way. And the notion of beauty, for example. We feel very strongly in the presence of beauty that we are experiencing something that is real and is out there, even though there may be disagreements about whether, what is beautiful and what isn't. But it seems to come to us from the outside. And it's the same, I think, with the sense of the sacred. Water. And I encountered this, in numerous other places in my life. I began encountering the poems of Rumi, but also William Blake. There's this one, for example: to see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. That wonderful sensibility that Blake had. When we talk to people today about religion, or just kind of live in this world of ours, the dominant question seems to be, do you believe in the existence of God? That's a question that seems to me greatly overrated. And if you really think about it, clearly it's not even that coherent of a question. When the great theologians talk about God, they tell us that God is quite unknowable. This is known in the West as the apophatic tradition, the God that cannot be spoken. The opening lines of the Tao Te Ching, that Chinese classic, where here the notion is Tao, which means way, rather than God, but the line reads, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. If you can say what it is not the Tao, it is not God. So to go around looking for the existence of God is, I think, somewhat misconceived. Far more important to ask, I think, how does God figure in your life? What is your relationship to God? Than this issue of existence. That question is treated as though it was sort of the means for dividing the religious from the non-religious, or sometimes the saved from the damned. If you believe in God, you're okay. And if you have doubts about it, there's something wrong with you. It's a rather dubious way. Even St. Thomas Aquinas, says that God is not a being. You cannot look for him as a kind of being. What he says, and I don't know quite what this means, but he says it's a pure act of being. And there's a wonderful story about St. Thomas. Thomas was a 13th century theologian. As of the 19th century, he was identified as the official theologian of the Roman Catholic Church. But when he was about 49 or 50 years old, and as it happened, about 3 months from death, he was performing a Mass on some feast day, and in the midst of the Mass, he had a very powerful mystical experience, the contents of which, unfortunately, have not been preserved. But he worked closely in his writing. At the time, he was writing the Summa Theologica. It was great work on theology. And he said to his friend, all that I have written is but straw. Having experienced God directly, or whatever it is he experienced, he realizes that his attempt to articulate in language what this all means. He's been a failure, and he refused to write anything further, despite the pleading of his assistant. There's a passage. I actually have a whole chapter in this book that I'm working on the sacred, and I didn't think to look at it until late last night, and I can't remember the author of this passage. That's one of these memory problems, but it's a beautiful description of how this particular Buddhist writer experiences the sacred. He says, sacred denotes not a supermundane deity, but the everyday sublime, a delicious phrase there, the everyday sublime, that is revealed when the mind becomes still and focused through setting into the rhythm of breathing. He's thinking of concentrating on the breath in meditation. And later he adds, the sacred dimension of experience opens up as one lets go of the constructive, obsessive concern with me and mine, thereby allowing a return to a world that transcends one's petty interests and reflects one's ultimate concern. So the sacred in the everyday. This notion of panentheism, which I haven't really said much about, is usually explained as God exists in everything and everything exists in God. An alternative formulation of it, which I think I somewhat prefer, is that nature exists in God and God exists in nature. It's the interpenetration of the sacred, the divine, the holy, and the natural, and finding that within nature. This is what happens when we fall in love, I think. It's not just hormones. It is a sudden awakening to the divinity within another person. And it's a very precious form of experience. It's what we experience in great music. And I think I'll stop and open it up to remarks and thoughts or anything you might want to say.